lab.
Sure. So thanks. Sorry, I was looking around just now because I wasn't on the pointer. Should I point my hand or physical?
Pointer in my office.
Oh, we have the wrong one.
Thank you.
We can start off without it.
Reshaping, so say
Yeah, thanks, Zara. That's a nice introduction. It's really been a pleasure visiting here, and especially getting to spend some long time with Zara. It's been really awfully too long since we talked at length. Today, what I was going to tell you about is some mostly sort of basic science work in my laboratory, looking at the various sort of features of motor learning, trying to understand at sort of the level of the algorithms that the motor system uses, how it is that we sort of adapt and learn new motor skills, and what the processes that sort of govern how fast this occurs and various features by which it occurs. All right, so let's just sort of dive into it. So, at some level, what we do is study motor skill learning, and so you can sort of think of this as, how is it that you sort of progress from this, this 9-year-old kid who just scraped his knee on the skateboard because he can't, even though he's on a sort of flat parking lot, he just can't balance very well, or this cute little baby who's, when his mother would think he's making all kinds of beautiful music, right? Or this cute little girl who's taking and perhaps making her first basketball shot, right? To some level of expertise, where there's someone in a skateboarding competition, or a sort of a master pianist who's practiced for decades and is making really beautiful music, or the age of the slide showing here. There's this Ray John Rondo a couple of years ago who lost himself in strapping to Berlin. Okay. So how is it that you get from sort of naive levels of performance and sort of improve with practice? And so all these things that I talked about here, these are really things that at least some people find interesting, right? These sort of playing the piano and sort of playing basketball, playing sports at sort of a competition level, and they take years and years of practice. And so in my lab, we honestly sort of duck out on the difficulties involved in studying things like that directly, and instead we used to study sort of short-term motor learning, right? Which is a much simpler sort of boring task that few people besides me and my immediate sort of colleagues in the field would find interesting. But the idea is that if we can sort of pare down the tasks and study simple processes, we can learn things. Thank you. We can learn things that might give us some insight into these really difficult problems that no one yet understands. Okay? All right. So, okay. So what I'm going to talk about are a couple of different things. One are sort of the time scales involved in motor learning and memory. And mainly the idea that there seem to be distinct, they're different adaptive processes that underlie motor learning at very different time scales. And we're going to look and see sort of what are the sort of interesting, the most important properties of these processes, and sort of most interestingly, how these processes interact with one another, and sort of interact in sort of ways that aren't really trivial, and then how those interactions predict things about how you want to sort of make motor learning more efficient or more optimal. And then we'll talk about motor variability, so the fact that we're not robots, right? We can't do the same action with sort of arbitrarily high precision repeatedly, and so how does this sort of variability interact with our ability to learn, right? And so mainly we'll look at this recent work that we've done to show that variability might actually be a feature rather than a sort of a bug or a problem in the system, sort of the motor system. And I actually switched around the last part here. Okay, so let's look at the time scales of motor learning. So we're going to look at a few different sort of tasks, sort of laboratory motor learning tasks. And this is the first of them. It's called force field adaptation. So what we're going to do in most of this is study just simple reaching movements, right? So here's a person from above, and we just removed everything except the right arm. That's all we sort of care about here. And the idea is that they're holding on to the handle of here's a robotic arm, but it's not too important what it is. And they are making movements in this plane, denoted x, y. Right? And so each movement is really simple, and this is what we call a point-to-point reaching movement, right? So it's just a movement that starts off at one point, the start point, and then goes to the target. Sorry for production here. This is shown by the green circle, and will more or less go directly to the target as they show. Okay. And anyway, the idea is that during this point-to-point reaching movement, right, since people have been making movements that are roughly similar to this for their whole lives, that you're not going to really see anything that's going to give you a great amount of insight into learning if you just watch people execute individual movements. And so we're going to make things a little bit interesting by perturbing the movements, by applying what we call different physical dynamics or a force field. And so by force field, we're going to apply forces here, showing us doing by these little sort of vectors and these arrows here, right, that are a function of the motion. Okay? And specifically, you're going to do something fairly simple here and make the force vector, right, in x, y, a function of the velocity, x and y velocity. Okay? And so here is a linear force field. There's a linear relationship between the force vector and the velocity vector, and it's just given by sort of an off-diagonal antisymmetric matrix that makes the force vectors that we are going to apply perpendicular to the velocity, right? So the idea is that there is, if you're at this point where there's a positive y velocity, x velocity, then there's going to be a negative x force displayed. And if there is a positive x velocity with no y velocity, there's going to be a positive y force, etc. Right? And you can see that this size of the force grows linearly with the amount of velocity that go out from the center. You see linear increases all around. Okay? So this is just a type of perturbation. And so if you look at how this sort of idealized perturbation actually interacts with a particular movement, you get something like this, right? Where what's going on is that during the course of the sort of straight upwards movement, right, what you see is that you're going to generate positive y velocities, and so you're going to get forces that are to the left in the x direction, right? And you see this. And so the forces are, they start off small because at the beginning of your movement you have a low velocity, and then you move fastest midway through your movement, you have the largest forces, and as you slow down towards the end, the force trails off, right? And so if you do something like this during say, an upward movement, the person will get, a naive individual will get perturbed off something like what's shown in blue here, right? So instead of making a straight movement to the target, you get perturbed off in a sort of backwards 7 sort of shape, right? And if you move down, you get perturbed off the other way because, of course, the velocity vector is reversed, and so the force vector is perturbing it in reverse, which you also do this symmetrically, right? And so the thing is that if you do this over and over, you don't continually get pushed off of the course, right? With practice, you get better and better, so that your movements, after maybe just 50 or 60, even 20, 30, 50 trials, return so that they're mostly straight. Again, they're not perfectly so. This is because your brain actually makes a predictive compensation of this pattern of forces if you practice it. Okay, and so what we're going to study is how it is that you make this sort of compensation and what is it that underlies the memories for these so-called models of physical dynamics. Okay? So if you look at the learning another way, right, what you can do is generate what's called a learning curve, right? So here what I'm doing is sort of encapsulating sort of like the strength of the learning or the amplitude of the amount of the compensation that is learned, right? And plotting it against trial number, right? So this is trial number 0 here. After some baseline period where there's nothing to learn, you're suddenly confronted with a force field that will normalize in spaces of size 1 here. And then what you see is the adaptation sort of increases maybe more quickly at first and then a little bit more slowly after a little while until you compensate most of these external forces. Okay? And so what I'm going to talk about is that by looking closely at this, it turns out that you can break down this sort of this overall compensation into a couple of parts, right? And there's a fast part that's shown in red, which is a memory which learns quickly, but it also has a poor ability to retain information. Okay, and there's a slower learning that retains information well, but learns much more slowly. And so initially, the sort of fast learning process shown in red dominates the performance, and there's a crossover point where they have equal contributions, and then the slow learning is more important later. And so what we're going to do is look at evidence that this occurs, and then look at some other properties of these memories and see what we can do with them. All right? So we're going to come up with a learning model. I'm just going to sort of start with the idea here first, where there's this overall sort of short-term adaptation that occurs over 5 or 10 minutes of practice, so after over 50 or 100 or 200 trials, right? Has this fast process and a slow process, and you can write sort of really simple first-order difference equations and describe them that look something like this. And these are sort of equivalent to first-order differential equations that are just discrete, where the amount of some process on the next time step is equal to what it was previously times some retention factor A, that's going to be, and then it's going to be increased by some learning term, right? Where there's some error in your performance is going to drive your learning. It's going to be modified by a learning rate, B, okay? And so the idea is that for the fast learning, there's going to be the same form as for the slow learning. It's just that there's going to be a fast learning rate and a fast retention factor that are distinct from the slow learning rate and slow retention factor, right? Okay. And so, what's the evidence for this? And so, if you do an experiment where the amount of the force field disturbance, right, looks like this over trials, right, where there's some baseline. Usually make your baselines longer than this, because it's just a simulation, so it's not important, where there's no disturbance. And then suddenly you turn on this force field, you have a disturbance of 1, right? And then if you reverse the disturbance and then turn it on again, right, you get sort of an interesting behavior that people have seen in lots of different learning memory systems. And this behavior is called savings, okay? And so the idea is that this model reproduces savings. And so what savings is that if so in red is shown the learning that you would get from this, an illustration of learning. And what you see is that there's some learning of the initial part, and then you rapidly learn in the other direction or unlearn during this reversal of this force field, and then relearn. And if you look closely, what you see is this relearning is a bit steeper than the initial learning, and that's plotted out here, just taking these two curves and plotting them on top of one another. And you see is the relearning here shown as the dotted red line, right? This is quite a bit faster than the initial learning. And so at some level, right, this is just maybe sort of an obvious thing that you might expect if you're presented with a force field disturbance to learn once and then again, that learning the second time should be higher than learning the first time, right? But at some other level, right, it's really quite a sort of an astonishing little thing, right, where that we here in the simulation made it so that the amount of unlearning was such that you went back to the baseline level, right, in your performance. And so you think of things in terms of being deterministic. The initial performance level, right, before you are presented with the force field the first time and the second time is identical. And of course, the force field, which is the disturbance, is identical. But yet you had a different response, right? So how is it you can have a system that has the same starting conditions and the same sort of inputs, and yet generate a different response from them, right? And so the idea here is that, well, if we have if we have multiple processes involved, not just one, but even though the initial performance level shown in red here, right, is the same second go round as it was the first go round, right? This could happen because of a different combination of the two parts that contribute to it, right? And so what happens is that in this sort of baseline state, both of these sort of learning processes, because there's nothing they previously learned, were at 0, and they both respond to the stimulus, right, as shown here. And then during the unlearning, this fast process shown as green here, right, actually sort of overzealous and actually, because there's error in the overall performance, actually sort of, unlearns rapidly, so it goes to a negative value, right? And of course, the visits value actually negates the positive value of the slow process, then the overall learning will be 0. There's something else. Okay? So that's an idea. It's just an explanation. It doesn't actually prove anything, right? But this generates some predictions, right, that you can look at. And so one is if you made a modification of this experiment where after this sort of unlearning period you had washout trials, right, where you turned this force field to 0 for a while before you started the relearning, right, it would make predictions about the amount of savings. And it turns out that as you have more and more washout, then what's going to happen is that these two processes, which are opposite one another, are going to come closer and closer together, and then the amount of savings you're going to get is going to decrease. So in the paper, we sort of show that this happens experimentally. But perhaps a more interesting prediction it makes is this one. And so the idea is if you take a version of the previous paradigm, but instead of having sort of baseline and then learning, and then opposite learning and then relearning, if you replace this relearning period by a period where you enforce there's no errors in your performance, force that people's performance is perfect no matter what they do. Okay, and so remember in this, and so we call this an error clamp, where we're clamping people's errors essentially to 0, right? So remember, what we're doing, of course, with this force field is pushing movements off course laterally, right? And so instead of having sort of no forces in some baseline, right, or having a force field where we have sort of a force that's determined by something in the motion, what you could instead do is basically use this sort of robot to simulate sort of a stiff channel, right, where people are making movements through a virtual channel that forces them in a straight path, right, to the target, right. So they're free in sort of a y direction, but in the x direction is a really stiff spring that doesn't let them sort of move out, right. And so no matter what pattern of forces they push with, they're going to move sort of straight to the target, and that's going to be what we call an error clamp. Okay? And so, so if we do this so that errors are forced to be 0, right, we can measure the forces that they're actually pushing with, right? And so what this model predicts is something that's pretty interesting, right? So there's this fast process that's in green that initially learns quickly, but then runs out of steam because it can't retain information well, and it jumps negative, as we said before, during the unlearning period, right, compared to the slow process, which builds up slowly and is still at some positive value when the overall performance returns to 0, right? And so if you have these error clamp trials where there's no error in your overall performance, right, no matter what you actually do, right, then neither of these processes will have an incentive to learn, right, and each of them will decay according to their own sort of natural dynamics, right? And so what we have is this fast process, right, will decay quickly, right, back down to 0. It's a negative value, so the decay is actually upwards here. And the slow process will decay slowly because it retains information well. And so if you sort of sum up these two sort of decay curves, right, one that's sort of a down-going one and one that's an up-going one goes towards 0, right, what you get is sort of a weird double exponential shape where you initially sort of rise and then go back down. So you rise according to the fast recovery from negative decay, and then decay down to 0 along with sort of the slow recovery from the slow system decay, right? And so we can do an experiment where we can see whether or not this happens, and the experiment shows that in fact it does, right? So if you train someone to learn this force field, you get this sort of pattern we talked about before, shown in blue, and then if I'm not showing the data from the opposite learning, but then if you have this opposite learning so that it starts your performance after this period near 0, right? And then you take away any errors from people's performance, right? So you give them an incentive to do anything. You see as they naturally sort of produce forces that are like what they did earlier in the learning, and then naturally comes down, right? And so this multi-rate model sort of predicts this in green, and then in red, this is the previous model people thought before this work was going on. You can see it doesn't actually predict the data at all. All right. So, so we're left with the idea that there's some evidence that there might be multiple processes involved in learning, at least skill in a short time period. And so one thing we wanted to do with this is say, well, do these two different processes, this fast process shown in red and the slow process shown in blue, do they, is it possible that they contribute to our long-term retention of motor skill learning differentially, right? And so I'm not going to look at any really long-term retention. This is difficult experimentally, but we'll take as a proxy for long-term retention, just retention over the course of 24 hours, right? So people will do this experiment and then come back the next day, and we'll test the retention of this motor learning. Okay? All right. And so one way we can get that is by looking at subjects who have different amounts of learning on the first day, right? So on the first day, we could look at subjects who only learn a little bit, right? So that this fast process is dominating, right? Or some intermediate amount where they have similar contributions from the slow and fast, or late or later in this period where they're being dominated by the slow learning and the much less fast learning, right? And so the idea is that we can look and see what's the pattern of retention in these cases, and does it go along with sort of the pattern of overall learning, or or the level of this slow process, or the level of this fast process, right? Or some mixture, right? Or combination, right? And so here's a sort of description of this paradigm where after a baseline period you vary the amount of initial learning and you test for retention the next day, right? And so the initial learning, right, looks at, as you'd expect it to, right? These different groups, basically the data is a bit noisy, but they're sort of tracing out the same learning curve, right? Obviously to a longer extent if you're in a group that has more trials, and to a shorter extent if you're in the little red group that has only 11 training trials, right? But the interesting thing is then we'll look for the retention level on the next day, right, after the 24-hour break, right? And what you see is that there's this sort of pattern of retention, right? It doesn't really look like the pattern of learning, right? So the obvious thing is that the retention is smaller than the amount of learning on the first day, because there's some forgetting that took place, right? And that's not terribly interesting. But what's interesting is the learning has a sort of fast initial phase, right, where most, maybe half or 2/3 of the learning happens just in the first 5 or 10 trials, and it's a slower improvement after that. And here it's that sort of all of the improvement is slow, right? And so if we sort of take this model and then just basically take this slow shape, right? Take the overall shape of the overall learning and trace that over the data. So what I'm tracing over the data is just sizing so that the last point in the trials runs through the last data point here. What you see is it sort of misses the data, right? Because it predicts that there's a faster increase at the end, right? But if you do this for the slow process, what you see is it really explains the data well. And actually, it turns out that the shape of this blue line correlates with the shape of the data. So what that does is it suggests that there's two processes involved in initial learning, this fast process and the slow process, but 24 hours later, it's only what you've learned from the fast process is going to contribute to retention, right? So what's learned from this, only what you've learned from the slow process is going to contribute to retention. Whatever you learned from the fast process is going to go away, even if that's all that you've learned, like in the trial, right? So the next thing was to look at an effect that psychologists have known about for over 100 years, and there are sort of like many sort of theories, experimental psychology to explain this. So that, of course, the idea that there are many theories means that no one actually knows what's going on. And so this is called the spacing effect. And if you haven't heard of this effect formally, you probably have heard of it somewhat informally. And so Hermann Ebbinghaus, who's considered sort of the father of modern experimental psychology, stated this effect this way that he discovered. And it's like the schoolboy doesn't, or maybe shouldn't, force himself to learn his vocabularies and rules altogether at night, but he knows that he should impress them again in the morning. And so what he's getting at is that if you want to learn something that's important, that you want to be able to sort of hold on to for a long period of time, you shouldn't sort of study in one big class, right? You should space out your study over several episodes, right? And so it's not necessarily, right, it's more acute than just how much you should study, right? So that, if you have a test, say on an exam on Friday, right, they're saying that, it's better to study in 1 hour each, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, right, rather than on a 4-hour block on Thursday. So in analysis, I always do this, right? It doesn't mean you're lazy, right, because they let you study just as much if you're going all nighter. But the idea is that if you do this, then even though your performance, might be good on the test, that your long-term retention is going to be, worse. And that's the idea of the spacing effect. So the spaced training, right, produces more enduring learning than massed training. Okay, with the amount of training, this is the stuff is controlled constantly. Okay, so so before we attack this, what we're going to do is try to learn a little bit more about this fast and slow learning processes, right? And so what we did before was look at long-term retention, right, over the course of a day, right, 24 hours. But it might be good to look at retention of learning at a very different time scale, right, over the time scale of seconds, like much more immediate, right? And so we did this experiment where after some baseline and training with a force field, what we did was expose subjects to a delay that could vary in one of 7 different time periods, right? And then tested for retention of learning after this short delay, going from 0 to 2 minutes, right? And then retrained to asymptotic performance, and then repeat, exposing someone to a different delay and testing them so we could get, there's lots of data about how well people can retain information over the time scale of seconds. And so if we did this, we get data that looks something like this. This is sort of the raw data I'm showing you for the first time. And so here what I'm showing you is force reported by this robot arm, right, as a function of time during the movement. And so I'm just aligning the movements by the time of the peak speed point, just so that's a convenient way to align the movement. So the point where you're moving fastest, which is in the middle of the movement, right? And so remember, this is a velocity-dependent force field. So the lateral force should ideally follow the shape of the velocity profile of the movement, right? And so the robot produced force, this experiment is shown on average what's in the black dotted line, right? And so the ideal compensation in some sort of simple naive way is just the equal and opposite to this robot produced force. That shows this green dashed line. And what you see is that is the results of this experiment plotted on top of that, right? And so in light blue are the forces that people produce after this training if they are tested after no delay whatsoever, right? And then after 6 seconds, 12, 20, 30, 60, 120 seconds, right? And look at this carefully. What you see is that, well, after 0 seconds, they're really approximating the ideal force. Well, they have a really strong memory of what to do with this force field. And then it drops down at 6 seconds, right? And maybe a little further down at 12, and then drops down further at 30 seconds. And there's really not a big difference between 30, 60, and 120 seconds, right? Even though there's a 90-second span there compared to the 30-second span getting up to 30 seconds in the first place. And so if you quantify these by just having some metric that quantifies the size of these, and then look at what we call this the gain of adaptation, then what you see is that this gain, right, starts at a level that's approximately 0.8 and goes down, right, over the course of this experiment. But a simple exponential fit really sort of describes this pattern really well. And this fit has a time constant of 20 seconds, right? So what this says is this learning that you do, right, seems to decay with a time constant of about 20 seconds, right? Really rapid, but it doesn't completely decay, right? So it decays away from a level of 0.8 to a level of 0.6, and then whatever is still there at 0.6 sort of seems like it's stable. and stays around, right? That's sort of interesting, right? Because if we look at our sort of computational model from before, the sort of the overall learning level, which is predicted to be about 0.8, it's composed roughly of 0.6 from slow and 0.2 from fast, right? And so maybe this decay is the fast process decaying away really rapidly in time. So before we thought it wasn't there 24 hours later, maybe it's just barely there even 24 seconds later. Right? But this could just be sort of a correspondence between sort of this level and the level amount of decay here and level of the fast process. And so in the interest of time, we'll skip past this actually. And we'll show this. And so what you can do, instead of just recording the amount so what you can do, instead of training subjects to asymptote, right, and then doing an experiment where you look at the decay at different amounts of time, right, what you can do is take advantage of what we've learned here and say that there's a part that's going to decay away, and that's going to decay away with a time constant of 20 seconds. So if we measure how much is decaying at 60 seconds, then we know how much of the overall learning is temporally labile, right? It's not stable, right? And we also know how much is stable. So here, there's 0.8 of total learning, and if we look at it at 60 seconds, we can see about 0.2 of that is gone, so it's labile, and about 0.6 that remains, and that's stable, right? But instead of looking at those at a single point of training, right, at asymptote, what we can do is look at how much of the learning is labile and stable all throughout the learning curve, right? By at different points along the learning curve, give 60-second delays and see how things trace out. Okay. So let's take a look at this. And so this is how this experiment goes. And so here's, in red is the overall adaptation, right? It's measured every 20 trials during this experiment, right? And then there's a stable component and a labile component that are measured because every 20 trials you give a 60-second delay, okay? So the idea is that before the 60-second delay, you measure the adaptation, that's the overall adaptation, right? Then after that delay, you measure the adaptation, that's a stable component, right? And the labile component, it's not a different piece of data, it's just a difference between the stable and the overall. Right? There's just a difference here, which is plotted as the third thing. Okay? And so what's really sort of remarkable is these shapes that are traced out here, right, really bear a pretty remarkable resemblance to this computational model, right, where we predicted that the overall learning, right, shown in red here, would break down into a fast and a slow part. Here we can actually measure stable and labile components, and I see that they really correspond, like, time point by time point, to this fast and slow process. Okay. So now if you look, we have like a handle on something about this, something sort of tangible about these processes, and maybe we can make some headway into understanding something complicated like this Ebbinghaus savings effect. Okay. But before that, let's just look at this. So if we sort of take what we've learned here, we can have a sort of different view of a learning curve than what people sort of previously thought, right? And so when I presented the learning curve to you before, we talked about how much you learned on one trial versus another. And the idea is that, as you go from trial 1 to 2, 3 to 4, your learning is going to increase, right? And eventually it's going to peter out somewhere. Not quite a trial 40, but it's going to keep going, right? And so the idea is that if we think that there's a part of your learning that's temporarily labile, then the learning curve is not just connecting these points, right? That it's actually sort of dynamic, and it's going to be sort of sawtooth shaped. That right after a trial you're going to learn, right? But that learning is partially temporally labile, right? It's not all stable, and so that learning that you did is going to decay down until you have another trial that's going to inject some more learning, and then it's going to decay down and inject some more learning, right? And that could just be a curiosity, right? But you could think that, well, that's going to cause the learning curves to look really rather different if you have short periods between trials. It's shown in blue here. So here's a simulation. In blue is a simulation where there's 3 seconds between trials. So trials are, at 3, 6, 9, 12 seconds, etc. Versus long periods between trials. So this is 16-second inter-trial interval, right? So trials are at 0, 16, 32 seconds, right? And of course, the point is that with the 16-second inter-trial interval, right, even though the shape of the decay is the same as with the 3-second inter-trial interval, right? There's going to be more overall decay because there's more time to decay, right? And since the time constant decay was 20 seconds, a 16-second interval interval will mostly sort of, mostly sort of annihilate the level of this fast process, right? Okay. Compared to this 3-second interval, where the fast process would mostly attack. So what we can do is go through sort of a scenario, right? And so the scenario is sort of a story where that there's a signal that drives learning, and we think from other evidence this is motor error, and I've shown in E. And so this error that drives learning is going to sort of increase the value of both this fast learning process and the slow learning process, right? And of course, the overall learning is just the sum of these two components, right? Of course, the error is just the difference between the performance level, X, here, the total learning, right, and the disturbance, right? So remember, if you totally learn, then there would be no error because what you learned is masked and equalize the disturbance, right? But if we look and see what we've learned about learning and memory here, what we see is that there's if we increase the inter-trial interval between trials, that will selectively decrease the level of the fast process and have no real effect on the slow process, right? But decreased level of the fast process, right, will, according to this diagram, decrease the overall learning, right, which will increase the error, right, which will increase the level of the slow process. So somewhat counterintuitive that by doing something that causes a decay in one process, you'll actually be predicted mathematically to get a compensatory increase in the level of the other process. And since the slow process is what leads to long-term retention, right? The idea is that increasing the inter-trial interval, right, actually leads to better long-term retention. So it's sort of counterintuitive. Doing something that leads to more decay actually causes better retention, right? And so there's no way. So the story increasing the trial spacing causes a decrease in the fast, which causes an increase in the error, and that's an increase in the slow process, and increases retention. Right? So we could, of course, take some intermediate things out and sort of say that, show that going from the fast process to the slow process has a single negative sign, and therefore this is a negative relationship between fast and slow, and also similar between slow and fast. Okay. So we can sort of do this experiment, right, that looks at the effects of different intertrial intervals. And so here is a sort of 3-second intertrial interval, and here's a 16-second intertrial interval. We can simulate what we'd expect from this, right, based on what we know about the learning of these processes and the time constants for decay, right? And so the idea is that this 3-second intertrial interval that has very little decay between trials is going to learn a lot because there's very little decay, right? And it's going to have a high level of the fast process that's shown as the thick dotted lines here, right? But that's going to result in relatively low, slow learning, right? And in contrast, the 16-second intertrial interval is going to have reduced overall learning compared to the 3-second case, right? And much reduced level of this fast process because it's going to decay away between trials, right? But because of that, it's going to have an increase in the level of the slow process, shown in green here, and then an increase in long-term retention. So we can actually do the experiment and see whether these sort of results sort of quantitatively line up with our predictions here, right? And so the important thing is that we can really sort of get a real sort of interesting look at this, because instead of just sort of predicting how much long-term retention we have, we can actually measure all of the sort of intermediate variables that we hypothesize that we sort of control in this process and see if they all sort of line up for us, right? And so here are the sort of the raw experimental results. And we see is that, as predicted, the slow, longer intertrial interval that shown in green leads to slower learning, right? But despite the fact that it leads to slower learning, when you put in 1-minute delays, a couple of places in the experiment, you can see is that there was slower learning to get there, but there was better retention after 1-minute delay, right? Compared to the 3-second group that had better performance before the delay, but actually worse performance after it. Okay? And this corresponded to better performance on the 24-hour testing for the long trial. And so what you see is that this, if we looked at the amount of 24-hour retention, that the long intertrial interval group, right, had better retention despite the sort of the same amount of sort of overall learning at the end, right? But if you plotted the 24-hour retention against the 60-second retention, or the amount of the stable process, what you see is that they were collinear, right? Suggesting that there's a sort of a linear relation between 60-second retention and 24-hour retention. Okay. And this makes sense, right? Because we think the 60-second retention is indicative of the level of the slow process, right? And the slow process was previously shown to be the one that corresponded to 24-hour retention. All right. So here's the theory of what should go on. And if we look at the experimental data, what we see is that the increase in the intertrial spacing, right? The increase in intertrial spacing is what was in the green group, right? 16-second intertrial interval group, caused a decrease in the level of the fast process, right? If we measure the temporally labile component of the adaptation of the fast process, we see it's greatly decreased. And that should predict an increase in motor errors, which we see in the 16-second group, right? And an increase in the level of the slow process, right? And an increase in retention, which should be proportional to this increase in we see a really close match. Okay? All right. Okay, that's the first part. What time is it? Yeah, what time should I think now? I mean, it started a little late.
Seminars are from 4 to 5 in general.
Okay. Can we see?
Started a little bit late, so 15 more minutes.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So then, okay, so basically the sort of first part is about sort of, looking at these time scales in adaptation and, trying to, break it down into two parts and to look and see how these parts are interact with, to lead to 24-hour retention, right? And so the idea is that, if you have some sort of ability to do this, what you could do is, modulate the amount of intertrial spacing, right, to sort of optimize the level of retention, right? And so if you equate the number of trials, right, the same amount of training, then the greater the spacing, the greater the retention. But if you say instead have a more sort of realistic, sort of real-world scenario where it's not a certain number of trials, repetitions that you could do, but a certain amount of time you have to do it, right? Then it turns out that you could actually figure out there's an optimal spacing, right, that will produce the best retention. So we're starting to work on that. All right. So the next thing we're going to do is look a little bit about the relationship between motor variability and motor learning. Okay, and so probably none of you recognize this gentleman, right? Raise your hands if you do. There's no reason you should. And so so this is a professional golfer, but it turns out that I don't play golf. But on the professional golf tour in the United States, there's actually a couple of levels of it. There's like the PGA tour, and then there's the second level tour. If you've been a professional, but not good enough to be on the PGA tour, that it's called the nationwide tour, right? And this guy's on the nationwide tour. But he did something that's sort of interesting. And what he did, his name is Brendan Todd, and what he did is he's the only golfer to ever hit 2 consecutive hole-in-ones in a professional tournament, right? And so what I mean by consecutive here is a little weird. It's in a golf tournament, what you do is you play all 18 holes one day, and then you play the same 18 holes, days 2, 3, and 4. And so by consecutive, I mean like hole-in-ones on the same hole. So this would be on separate days where this happened, right? So that's pretty remarkable, right? That in all of the sort of the rounds of professional golf we played, no one's ever done this, right? And so it sort of gets at that if you did something remarkable once, hit a hole-in-one, you just can't really repeat the action. Right? If you know anything about golf, it's a little more different than that. Of course, the wind conditions would be different, and the pin placement is different. Even if you took those things away, right, it's pretty remarkable that we'll hit 2 hole-in-ones at the same time, right? But why is that? Right? Why is it that that it should be so hard to repeat an action if we did it, right, with high precision? And so, it's because there's a lot of variability in our actions. So I'm not going to show you these videos to save time. But this is an illustration that a colleague of mine made. And so this is a student in his lab who doesn't play tennis. He's wearing a white beater tank top. He's not a tennis player. And here's a guy who's the #1 player on the Harvard team or whatever. So he's been playing tennis for And so if you actually ask them to basically sort of serve the ball, right, and repeat the same motion over and over again in the serve, right, what you see is just sort of toy data. Is that Joe over here, right, doesn't do a very good job of repeating his motion over 5 consecutive trials. You can see that these trials are really distinctly different from each other. And this is very different than Vitaly here, who, these 5 trials, you can hardly see the difference between what he's doing, right? Of course, he's been told to do, this same thing to the best of his ability, right? And so we all sort of know from our general experience that this seems like there's a sort of inverse relationship, right, between variability and performance in motor learning, right? So that as learning proceeds, performance improves, right? It's better and better from small amount of performance to a high level of performance, right? And variability tends to go down, right? But it hasn't really been well understood. Like, what exactly is the relationship between this? Like, what's this, in detail? So, is it that you have high variability early on, right? And that stands in the way of having good performance, right? Or another possibility altogether is that this high variability early on actually enables you to be able to grow the ability to have good performance. That this high variability is actually necessary for the performance to improve. Okay? And so this is really largely inspired by my work in birdsong, where the sort of people who study the song learning in little finches. There's little finches that the Bengalese finch is shown here that sing these sort of elaborate sort of courtship songs, right? And so this is really important, right? Because if you don't sing a good song, you're not going to make genes. You're a little bird here, and you learn the song from your dad. But this song is difficult to learn in the baby bird studies for several months before he's able to make a good song. And so in this sort of birdsong system, this is a blow up of a bird brain. It's been shown that there's this area in the brain that's thought to be some sort of frontal area, a more cortical-like area, that's actually called LMAN, for abbreviation, that's actually thought to actively inject variability into this song. So if you were to do a small lesion of this bird brain, right, or to cool it down, so to lesion it temporarily, then the juvenile song is actually more consistent from one rendition to the next, right? But if you do this for a long period of time, it turns out that this juvenile song, even who's listening to his dad sing, basically gets sort of frozen in this state. So that it has an immature song that normally is really variable from one trial to the next, and progresses to the beautiful mature song. But if you lesion this area, the variability goes down, but then the high quality song never emerges. You sort of continue sort of where you are. Right? So this idea, when this is bird learning, that this variability is actually sort of required for the emergence of birds with good performance. Right? Because there's more to a tennis serve than doing the same thing over and over again. You want to have high velocity of the ball, spin it, do all kinds of things that aren't directly related to variability. Right? But what goes on in humans? And surprising people haven't looked at this too well. Okay, so we did this with sort of inventing another task. And it's another sort of boring task. And we'll again have people move from one point to another. The idea here is that if you ask people to move from one point to another, their movements aren't all the same. There's just some variability that's natural inherent in this is typical of what people do. Right? So people are asking 200 millimeter movements, those are 8-inch movements that are rapid from one point to the next. This is how much variability you see from one trial to the next. Okay? It turns out that you can actually mathematically describe this variability in a really low-dimensional space. So this is actually sort of a principal components analysis on the shapes of these movements. And it turns out that you just have 3 basis vectors for principal components here that you can describe to like 99-point-something% of what the variability inherent in the shapes of these trajectories. And so the main types of variability is just the variability in aiming directions. This is just almost sort of a straight sort of slanted line here, that some movements are sort of aimed off more to the right and some are aimed more to the left. And then there's a little bit of variability that goes in a sort of a C shape shown in blue here, and then a little bit that goes in an S shape. And if you put these together, you explain almost everything in these repertoire of shapes. I mean, if you have a linear combination of these basis vectors, you can explain every single one of these movements really well. Okay? So we can take this sort of complicated thing like a shape here and of movement and represent it as just a single point in three-dimensional space where a certain amount of basis vector 1, a certain amount of basis vector 2, shown in blue, and a certain amount of basis vector 3. You put those moves together, you get this purple movement that really matches, purple approximation to the red movement that matches it pretty well. Okay? So, these places 99.9% of the variance you get in all of the movements on average. Okay. So you can imagine that, you know, obviously someone has not just one movement, but many, and so there's a distribution over these basis vectors, right, across all of their trials, which we should view as this cloud. And you can further imagine that, you know, what you can do is have a task where you train subjects to shift these distributions in one way or another. So, you know, to add a certain amount here of basis vector 2, increase the amount of basis vector 2, and you have some tasks where you train people to, instead of doing this, to do this in terms of doing this, right? And you can further imagine that different subjects, right, start off with different patterns of variability, right? So some subjects, like this red one here, has a lot of variability for basis vector 2, but not so much for basis vector 3. And this sort of yellow one here has sort of, you know, less than average for basis vector 2, but more than average for basis vector 3, because it's sort of it's more vertical component for most people, but less horizontal, right? And all kinds of things in between, right? And then what we can do is we can look at performance on this sort of shifting task where you're asked to change the shape of your movements on average, right? And break it down by the by this variability. Okay, and so we're asking people to, in this task, learn to have more basis vector 2 in their movement, right? And if you plot the learning rate for this, right, as a function of the variability in the dimension of basis vector 2, here, the horizontal variability, what you see is there's a high sort of positive correlation, right? And so another way you could sort of view this as, is by sort of just taking the subjects and people who have above average variability for basis vector 2 versus below average variability for basis vector 2 in the baseline. So taking their baseline performance, sorting people, and then looking at their learning rate. You see there's really quite a huge difference, right? And here's a plot which was a subject. But, you know, as you can imagine, well, it's not totally clean, right? Because if subjects have higher variability for basis vector 2, they might tend to have higher variability overall as well, right? And so if you look at the total baseline variability, it's also even though more weakly, it's correlated to the initial learning rate. So we don't really know is that if there's a sense that variability is correlated to learning, we don't know if it's really the variability that that's task relevant, right, or the total. And so but to dissociate this, what we can do is look at a task where we have people change basis vector 3, and the other component, we see how things sort of sort out, right? And so the idea here is that on average, people have more variability for basis vector 2 than basis vector 3, so the second versus the third components, and named them that way. And so if we predicted the learning based on this, right, you'd see higher variability for basis vector 2 should lead to higher learning, right, than you see for basis vector 3. So you predict sort of overall learning that looks like this for these two groups. And if you look at the data, what you see is that, well, you get something that sort of aligns with these predictions, right? And then, furthermore, in addition to sort of the overall learning effects for these two groups, what you can see is that the subjects individually show this positive correlation that we saw before between task-specific baseline variability and overall learning rate. The really nice thing is you take these sort of individual relationships between baseline variability and overall learning rate for these two groups, the blue line and the green line, right? And then you can see that altogether it accounts for correlation coefficient of 0.75, right? So 0.75 squared variance of the data. But if you take a single relationship, right, that encompasses both of them, right, what you see is that accounts for just as much variability, right? So the idea here is that a single relationship is able to account for the relationship between the centers of the groups, right, and the relationship within each of the groups, right? Because these two within group relationships really are not very different from each other, and they both would sort of extrapolate it out and do a pretty job of explaining the center of the next one. Right? And so that gives us some information that it really seems like it's task-specific baseline variability rather than the overall variability that's related to how well you learn, right? Because if it was overall variability, then this group that has less task-specific variability overall would be lower than some. Right. So how general was that? People, even though it had not been shown before, I didn't tell you the details of this task, the shifting task, but we basically got people to shift their motor output by giving them scores. And there's been sort of lots of sort of theoretical work on what's called reinforcement learning from scores or from other types of scalar metrics that have suggested that variability is important in learning. There's something called the sort of exploration and exploitation trade-offs, the classic sort of idea in reinforcement learning that exploration, which comes from variability, is necessary for learning, and that you should explore early so that you can exploit later. There's a trade-off between how much you should explore around, figure out what you should do, and how much you should exploit the current knowledge that you have. Okay. Next we decided to look at a really different task, the same force field learning task we performed. And so the thing that's different about this task is it's not thought to be learned by reinforcement at all. Instead, it's thought to be driven by errors, as we talked about before. Right? And it's thought to involve different brain areas, the cerebellum, basically. But we decided we could still play the same game and have people learn a velocity-dependent force field, right? But make good measurements of the variability in the baseline and segregate them in the baseline depending on the level of task-relevant variability. So since the task is velocity-dependent learning, we look at the variability that traced out in sort of velocity in terms of the velocity-dependent correlation of the forces, right? And if you separate subjects out based on this baseline variability, what you see is that there's also really large differences. So the subjects who have sort of the highest level of variability baseline, this darkest group here, right, really learn maybe 3 times as fast as subjects with the lowest variability. And if you just divide subjects into above and below, you don't see as big an effect as before, but you still have a statistically significant effect. Right? So the initial learning goes with the variability level. You can, of course, plot this subject by subject, and you can see this general relationship in the scatter of individual subjects, which corresponds to this. All right. But we can try to dig a little bit deeper here. How much? I'm going to finish in the next 5 minutes. Okay. We can try to dig a little bit deeper here and really try to sort of examine, well, what is it that's there in the patterns of baseline variability, right? So when we measured this baseline variability, was having in the baseline period a few of these error clamps that we talked about, where subjects were sort of forced to move straight, and then you can measure the force that they push up against the side of this virtual channel, right? And if you do that, what you see is a little bit of a mess. There's just 5 consecutive trials. And these are the lateral forces that you measure. And you can see that, well, that they're variable from one trial to the other. They vary by, plus or minus a couple of newtons or so force, and somewhat wiggly or oscillatory. But if you do this principal components analysis that we did before for the motion in the baseline for the other task, right? So this is a force task as opposed to a motion task. So we're going to do sort of analogous analysis. What you see is that, well, it's not nearly as clean. So instead of, there aren't 3 principal components that account for all the variability, but there really do seem to be like the first principal component accounts for much more variability than any of the remaining ones, right? So the first one accounts for 40%, and the next 2 after that account for 10 or 11%. So the first 3, instead of accounting for 9, they together account for like 60%, right? But it's sort of interesting, the first one accounts for so much more than anything else, right? So let's see what this first principal component is. So the shape of the first principal component for this force looks like that, which is overall maybe a little bit unremarkable. But if you look at it sort of carefully as a function of the average sort of velocity during the movement at each point and the average position in the movement during each point, what you see is that a simple sort of linear combination of this velocity and position really seems to explain this shape really well, right? So it's weird that the sort of first principle, one of the main sort of way that these lateral force profiles vary, even though it's less than 50%, is accounted for by linear